Edgar Cayce the day he said his body would be buried. Edgar Cayce was not known for theatrical prophecy. Unlike the fortune tellers of popular imagination, he spoke softly, avoided spectacle, and rarely framed his statements as predictions at all. For decades, he insisted that what came through him while in trance was not foresight, but access, a reading of conditions already in motion. This distinction would become crucial when, in the final years of his life, Cayce began making remarks that sounded uncomfortably final. He did not speak of death in vague metaphors or symbolic language. Instead, he referred to specific days, specific physical outcomes, and a narrowing window of time in which his body would no longer be able to sustain the work he believed he had been called to do. By the early 1940s, Cayce's health was visibly failing. Years of entering deep trance states had taken a toll, something his own readings had warned about repeatedly. Those close to him urged rest, but Cayce refused to stop. He believed that halting the sessions would be a moral failure, a withdrawal of help from people who depended on the information he provided. In private conversations, he began to say that continuing would cost him his life not eventually, but soon. What unsettled those around him was not the sentiment, but the precision. Cayce stated that if he did not cease his work immediately, he would not live beyond the beginning of 1945. This was not framed as fear. It was delivered as a conclusion. According to associates, Cayce spoke as if he were reading from the same internal source that had guided him for decades. In one account, he told a confidant that his body would be laid away shortly after the start of the new year. He did not predict illness, accident, or external cause. He simply described an endpoint, fixed and unavoidable if his behavior remained unchanged. To those familiar with his work, this was consistent with his philosophy. The future was not destiny, but consequence. January arrived, and Cayce's condition deteriorated rapidly. He suffered a series of strokes that left him bedridden and unable to speak. As his family gathered around him, they recalled the earlier statements, the warnings, the dates, the refusal to stop. On January 3rd, 1945, Edgar Cayce died. The timing matched what he had said months before with unsettling accuracy. Even more striking was the absence of surprise among those closest to him. They did not speak of shock, only of recognition. For believers, this was the final confirmation of Cayce's extraordinary perception. For skeptics, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy brought about by exhaustion and stress. But neither explanation fully accounts for the calm certainty with which Cayce spoke of his own end, or the lack of ambiguity in his language. He did not say he feared dying. He said he would be buried, and then he was. What remains most disturbing is not that Cayce foresaw his death, but that he treated it as negotiable until it wasn't. His statements suggest a moment when the future hardened, when possibility narrowed into inevitability. Whether one interprets this as psychic foresight or psychological collapse, the record shows that Edgar Cayce announced his own death not as a vision, but as a fact waiting for its date. Mark Twain arriving and leaving with Halley's Comet. Mark Twain never presented himself as a mystic, yet few figures in American history left behind a record of statements about death so precise, so publicly documented, and so eerily fulfilled. Born Samuel Langhorne Clemens in 1835, Twain was a man obsessed with patterns, cycles, and the absurd repetitions of human existence. He distrusted superstition, mocked spiritualism, and dismantled religious certainty with surgical wit. And yet, when it came to his own life, he made one prediction that would later prove impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Twain was born in November 1835, just weeks after Halley's Comet made its periodic appearance in Earth's skies. This fact fascinated him. The comet, visible roughly every 76 years, became for Twain a cosmic timestamp a celestial punctuation mark at the beginning of his life. As he aged, he spoke of it often, not in reverent terms, but with a kind of amused inevitability. In 1909, as the comet's return approached, Twain made a remark that would be quoted endlessly after his death. "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. He said, 'It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it.'" At the time, the statement was treated as a joke, a flourish of Twain's characteristic dark humor. He was in his 70s, frail, and no stranger to morbidity. He had buried his wife and multiple children, and his later writings were saturated with reflections on mortality. Yet the confidence of his phrasing was notable. He did not say he hoped or suspected. He said he expected, and he attached that expectation to a fixed astronomical event beyond human influence. As Halley's Comet grew brighter in the spring of 1910, Twain's health declined sharply. He suffered from angina and recurring chest pain. Newspapers reported on both his condition and the comet's approach. Often in the same breath, Twain himself seemed unbothered. According to those around him, he spoke of death with composure, even anticipation. The comet was not a symbol to him, it was a schedule. On April 21st, 1910, one day after Halley's Comet made its closest pass to Earth, Mark Twain died of a heart attack. The alignment was exact, not approximate, not symbolic, exact. The event stunned the public. What had once sounded like a macabre joke was suddenly reclassified as something else, a declaration that had found its mark. Skeptics argue that the prediction was statistically unremarkable. Twain was elderly. Death was likely. The comet's return merely provided a poetic framework. But this explanation ignores the psychological dimension of Twain's certainty. He did not revise the statement as his health fluctuated. He did not soften it into metaphor. He repeated it, calmly, publicly, without hedging. And when the moment came, the timing was precise enough to provoke discomfort, even among rationalists. More unsettling still is Twain's broader fixation on predetermined endings. In his final essays, he wrote of humanity as trapped in cycles, compelled by forces it neither sees nor understands. Free will, he suggested, was largely an illusion, a comforting fiction layered over inevitability. Read in this context, his comment about the comet no longer appears casual. It reads like a conclusion reached long before it was spoken. Whether Twain believed in cosmic destiny or simply recognized the poetry of coincidence remains unresolved. What cannot be dismissed is that he publicly tethered his death to a celestial event decades in advance, and that reality complied. In doing so, Mark Twain joined a small, unsettling category of individuals whose final statements seem less like speculation and more like alignment with something already decided. Abraham Lincoln, the assassination dream he shared days before. Abraham Lincoln was not a man given to mystical language. His temperament was analytical, restrained, and grounded in rational argument. Yet, in the final weeks of his life, he confided a dream to close associates that would later read not as symbolism, but as rehearsal. It was not recorded as an offhand remark or private musing. It was shared deliberately, described in detail, and remembered precisely because of how closely it aligned with what followed. According to multiple accounts, including those preserved by Lincoln's friend Ward Hill Layman, the president described a dream in which he wandered through the White House after hearing the sound of crying. Room after room, he encountered mourners draped in black. When he asked who had died, the answer was always the same.
The president.
The president.
It always comes
in the
back
dream.
to the president.
Lincoln approached a corpse lying in state, guarded by soldiers. He looked upon the body and understood that it was his own. This dream was not dismissed as nightmare residue. Lincoln spoke of it calmly, without panic, and with an unusual seriousness. He reportedly recounted it within days of his assassination, not years earlier. What makes the account disturbing is not merely the content, but the context. Lincoln had survived multiple threats on his life. He was aware of the danger, yet he continued to move with minimal security. When asked to take precautions, he often declined, suggesting a resignation that went beyond courage. In the days leading up to April 14, 1865, Lincoln's language shifted. He spoke repeatedly of having seen the end of the war, but also hinted that his own future did not extend far beyond it. To those around him, these remarks sounded philosophical, the musings of a man exhausted by years of conflict. Only later did they appear prophetic. His final public address contained lines about not expecting to be here much longer, a phrase that at the time passed without alarm. On the night of his assassination, Lincoln attended Ford's Theater despite warnings. The dream he had described unfolded with chilling fidelity. His body was displayed in the White House. Soldiers stood guard. Mourners filled the rooms. The imagery matched the dream not in abstract emotion, but in physical arrangement. For those who remembered the account, the alignment was impossible to ignore. Historians often frame the dream as a psychological manifestation of stress, guilt, and fatigue. Lincoln had carried the weight of national death for 4 years. It is reasonable to assume his subconscious processed that burden through imagery of mourning. But this explanation falters when confronted with the timing. The dream was not a recurring theme. It emerged once, shortly before his death, and mirrored the aftermath with remarkable specificity. What remains most unsettling is Lincoln's response to the dream. He did not seek counsel. He did not express fear. He told it as one might recount a message not from God, but from somewhere internal and unavoidable. In a life defined by rationality, this single moment stands apart. It suggests not belief in destiny, but recognition of it. Whether the dream was premonition, coincidence, or the mind's final reckoning, it occupies a unique place in American history. Abraham Lincoln did not predict his assassination with dates or names. He did something quieter and perhaps more disturbing. He described the scene that would follow his death and then walked toward it. Frank Pastore, the radio host who described his final crash. Frank Pastore's premonition did not come wrapped in metaphor or dreams. It arrived through conversation ordinary, recorded, and preserved. A former Major League Baseball pitcher turned Christian radio host. Pastore spent his later years discussing faith, suffering, and personal transformation on air. He was articulate, reflective, and openly skeptical of sensational claims. Yet in the final months of his life, he began describing a future event with such specificity that, after his death, the recordings took on a disturbing weight. In November 2012, during a broadcast of his nationally syndicated radio show, Pastore spoke about a recurring internal sense that his life would end abruptly. He did not frame it as prophecy. He described it as an impression that would not leave him alone. What startled listeners was not the idea of death, a common topic on faith-based programs, but the manner in which he outlined it. He spoke of a sudden impact, of being struck while riding his motorcycle, of surviving the initial moment only to decline afterward. At the time, the comments were brushed aside as rhetorical devices meant to illustrate spiritual surrender. Pastore was known for using personal vulnerability to communicate larger ideas, but the language he used was unusually concrete. He did not say if something happens to me. He spoke as if rehearsing a sequence already fixed. In one exchange, he mentioned that if he were to be hit, it would likely be from behind a detail that would later prove significant. On November 19, 2012, Frank Pastore was riding his motorcycle on a Los Angeles freeway when he was rear-ended by a car. The impact threw him from the bike, causing severe head injuries. He survived the crash and was hospitalized in critical condition. For weeks, he remained alive but unresponsive, exactly as he had described, not dying immediately, but fading. On December 25th, 2012, he died from complications related to the accident. The recordings resurfaced almost immediately. Listeners who had heard the earlier broadcasts began sharing clips, stunned by the alignment. The specificity of the details, the motorcycle, the rear impact, the prolonged decline, made coincidence an unsatisfying explanation. Pastor had not merely acknowledged mortality. He had outlined a mechanism and a sequence. Skeptics point out that motorcycle riding carries inherent risk, and that Pastore was statistically aware of that danger. But this reasoning fails to address the temporal closeness of the statements to the event, or the confidence with which he spoke. He did not issue warnings or express anxiety. He spoke with calm acceptance, as if describing something already known. What complicates the narrative further is Pastore's own theology. He did not claim supernatural foresight. He rejected the idea of special revelation outside Scripture. And yet, he acknowledged that some knowledge arrives not through belief, but through conviction, a certainty, without explanation. In his final broadcasts, he described this feeling as neither fear nor peace, but inevitability. Frank Pastore's case is unsettling precisely because it exists on record. There is no reliance on secondhand memory or retrospective embellishment. His words remain intact, time-stamped, and available, whether interpreted as intuition, coincidence, or something more disturbing. They force a question that remains unanswered. How does a man describe the manner of his death in advance, and then experience it exactly as spoken? Mikey Welsh, the exact date he posted before dying. Mikey Welsh's premonition did not emerge from interviews, sermons, or late-night reflections. It appeared online, in plain text, visible to anyone who followed him, and time-stamped beyond dispute. Welsh, a former bassist for the band Weezer, had long struggled with mental health issues, including periods of instability and hospitalization. Because of this history, what he wrote in the weeks before his death was initially interpreted as symbolic, or worse, as dark humor. Only afterward did it become something else entirely. On September 8th, 2011, Welsh posted a message on social media that would later be circulated endlessly. Dreamt I died in Chicago, next weekend heart attack in my sleep. The phrasing was casual, almost dismissive. There was no alarm, no call for help, no elaboration. It read like a passing comment about an odd dream. Friends responded with concern, but Welsh brushed it off, replying that he was fine. He did not delete the post, he did not correct it. 10 days later, on September 19th, 2011, Mikey Welsh was found dead in a Chicago hotel room. The cause of death was ruled an accidental overdose, though the medical examiner noted that his heart had stopped while he was asleep. The location, the timing, and the condition aligned with the dream he had publicly described. The next weekend he mentioned was exact. What makes Welsh's case uniquely disturbing is the specificity and permanence of the record. This was not a recollection shared after the fact. It was a written statement, archived, and accessible before the event occurred. Unlike many alleged premonitions, it cannot be reshaped by memory or interpretation. The words exist exactly as they were written, unchanged by outcome. Skeptics argue that Welsh's history makes the prediction less remarkable. He was aware of his vulnerabilities. He traveled frequently. Dreams of death are common, particularly among those facing internal turmoil. But this explanation falters when confronted with the precision of the details. He named the city. He named the time frame. He named the condition. And he did so without urgency, as if reporting information rather than imagining it. Equally unsettling is what Welsh did not do. He did not seek medical attention. He did not cancel his trip. He did not express fear. Those close to him later described his tone in the final days as calm, even content. The post was not a warning. It was a statement. In the aftermath, Fans debated whether the dream was prophetic or psychological, a subconscious recognition of physical risk. Yet this debate overlooks a more troubling question. How does the mind generate a scenario so exact? And why does it sometimes appear not as anxiety, but as certainty? Welsh did not frame the dream as symbolic. He described it as literal. Mikey Welsh's death occupies a liminal space between foreknowledge and resignation. His words suggest a moment when the future was no longer abstract, but already formed. Whether that knowledge came from intuition, coincidence, or something less understood, the result is the same. He announced the date of his death and then arrived there. Lisa Lopes, the interview where she spoke about not living long.
I'm telling
Lisa
you,
Left Eye
I
Lopes
didn't
did
see
not predict her
anything
death with
unusual
dates
that
or
night.
mechanisms.
It was all
What she
very
expressed
quiet.
instead was something quieter and, in retrospect, more troubling, a sustained awareness that her life would end early. This awareness surfaced repeatedly in interviews, journals, and recorded conversations during the final years of her life. Unlike impulsive remarks made in moments of distress, Lopes's statements were measured, reflective, and consistent. She did not speak as someone afraid of dying. She spoke as someone who had already accepted it. By the early 2000s, Lopes had entered a period of intense self-examination. After years of success with TLC, she withdrew from the public eye and traveled extensively, spending long stretches in Honduras. There, she filmed herself daily, documenting her thoughts, dreams, and fears on video. These recordings, later released in documentary form, reveal a woman who believed she was undergoing a spiritual reckoning. She spoke often about karma, cycles, and balance, and about a sense that she would not be around much longer. In multiple interviews, Lopes stated plainly that she did not expect to live to old age. She framed this not as despair, but as knowledge. "I feel like something is going to happen to me," she said on camera, adding that she felt she was meant to go early. The language was not melodramatic. There was no visible panic. Instead, there was calm resignation, as if she were explaining an already known fact to someone who had not yet realized it. What makes these statements disturbing is their repetition. Lopes returned to the idea again and again, across different contexts, with different interviewers. She spoke of being ready and of having done what she came here to do. Those close to her later recalled that she often talked about death as a transition rather than an ending, and that she expressed concern not for herself, but for how others would react when she was gone. On April 25, 2002, Lisa Lopes was killed in a car accident in Honduras. She was a passenger in an SUV that veered off the road and rolled multiple times. She was the only fatality. The crash was sudden, violent, and entirely consistent with the kind of abrupt ending she had alluded to, not illness, not decline, but an immediate stop. In the days that followed, footage of her earlier interviews resurfaced, transforming what had once sounded philosophical into something far more unsettling. Skeptics point to risk factors. Lopes was traveling frequently, driving on unfamiliar roads, living an unconventional lifestyle. But this reasoning does not account for the clarity of her self-assessment. She did not speak in terms of probability. She spoke in terms of certainty. Nor does it explain why her focus on early death intensified rather than diminished as time passed. The most chilling material comes from Lopes's own recordings in Honduras, where she reflected on having narrowly avoided death in previous accidents and spoke of feeling that the next one would be final. These were not confessions made in isolation. They were documented, preserved, and unedited. They show a woman articulating an awareness that seems disproportionate to the information available to her. Lisa Lopes did not claim psychic ability. She did not describe visions or dreams of her death. What she demonstrated instead was something more ambiguous, an intuitive conviction that her life was approaching a boundary she could sense but not define. Whether interpreted as spiritual intuition, psychological projection, or coincidence sharpened by hindsight, her words remain difficult to dismiss. She told the world she would not be here long. And then, without warning, she wasn't. Buddy Holly, the comment made before boarding the fatal plane. Buddy Holly's final premonition was not framed as prophecy, vision, or fear. It surfaced as a remark, brief, offhand, and delivered in the casual tone of a man accustomed to constant motion. At the time, it sounded like fatigue speaking. Only later would it be remembered as something closer to acceptance. In early February 1959, Holly was exhausted. The winter dance party tour was punishing, with long overnight bus rides through freezing Midwest weather. The tour bus's heating system had failed repeatedly, leaving musicians sick, sleepless, and miserable. When a small charter plane became available to carry performers to the next stop, Holly decided to take it. Before boarding, he reportedly made a comment to those staying behind that would later be repeated with unease. "If this plane goes down," he said, "it'll be the end of me." The statement did not cause alarm. Musicians joked darkly about travel all the time. Flying was still viewed as risky in the 1950s, and gallows humor was common among touring acts. But those present later recalled that Holly did not laugh when he said it. The tone was flat, almost reflective, as if he were stating a conclusion rather than speculating about danger. Shortly after takeoff on February 3, 1959, the plane crashed into a cornfield in Iowa, killing Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P., the Big Bopper Richardson. The crash was immediate and unsurvivable. News spread quickly, transforming the earlier comment into something else entirely. What had sounded like weary exaggeration now read as a final acknowledgement. What complicates Holly's case is the absence of drama. He did not describe a dream. He did not share a fear. He did not attempt to dissuade others from flying. He simply boarded the plane. There was no attempt to alter the outcome. This lack of resistance has fueled speculation that Holly felt something more than caution, a sense that the risk was not abstract, but personal and final. Skeptics argue that the comment reflects nothing more than stress and statistical awareness. Small planes, poor weather, inexperienced pilots, the danger was real. But this explanation overlooks the psychological nuance. Holly had flown many times before. He had endured worse conditions. Yet, on this occasion, he verbalized an ending rather than a risk. He did not say the plane might crash. He said it would be the end of him. Adding to the unease are accounts that Holly had recently settled personal affairs, including business matters and songwriting credits. While not unusual for a touring musician, these actions, combined with his demeanor in the final days, suggest a man operating with a narrowed sense of future. Friends later described him as unusually quiet before the flight. Buddy Holly's premonition lacks the explicit detail seen in other cases. There is no date, no location, no mechanism spelled out in advance, and yet, the simplicity of the remark, its lack of flourish, is what makes it disturbing. It reads not like imagination, but like recognition, a statement made without hope of being disproven. In the end, Holly did not try to escape the outcome he seemed to acknowledge. He stepped onto the plane, took his seat, and vanished from history in the manner he had quietly named. Whether coincidence or intuition, the moment stands as one of the clearest examples of a final sentence spoken before a future that never arrived. Ronnie Van Zant, the band leader, who said he wouldn't reach old age. Ronnie Van Zant did not speak about death as a looming threat. He spoke about it as a limit already set, long before the plane crash that would end his life. Van Zant made repeated comments suggesting he did not expect to live past his 30s. These remarks were not tied to illness or fear. They appeared instead as a conviction, a boundary he seemed to recognize without understanding its origin. As the frontman of Leonard Skynyrd, Van Zant lived inside a culture that celebrated excess, risk, and defiance. Yet those close to him described a man far more introspective than his public image suggested. In interviews, he occasionally hinted at a shortened future, stating plainly that he did not believe he would grow old. The statements were delivered without drama, sometimes even with humor, but they were consistent enough to be remembered after the fact. What separates Van Zant's case from casual bravado is the absence of recklessness in his behavior during the final years. He did not accelerate his lifestyle as if racing against time. If anything, he was attempting to stabilize it. Friends noted that he had begun making plans for the band's long-term future, mentoring younger musicians, and speaking about responsibility, and yet, the sense that his own future was truncated never left his language. On October 20th, 1977, Leonard Skyner's chartered Convair CV-240 aircraft ran out of fuel mid-flight and crashed into a wooded area in Mississippi. Van Zant was killed instantly, along with band members Steve Gaines and Cassie Gaines. He was 30 years old, the age at which he had so often implied his life would end. In the aftermath, interviews resurfaced in which Van Zant had said, almost casually, that he would never see 40. Unlike many musicians whose comments about dying young are made in the heat of performance or intoxication, Van Zant's remarks were often delivered soberly, off stage, and without provocation. They were not warnings. They were acknowledgments. Skeptics attribute this to lifestyle awareness. Touring musicians face danger. Small planes, late nights, and constant movement carry risk. But this explanation again fails to account for the tone of inevitability. Van Zant did not say he feared dying young. He said he would. There is a difference between expectation and acceptance, and Van Zant appeared to live in the latter. More unsettling still is that those close to him reported he seemed at peace with the idea. There was no urgency to escape it, no attempt to bargain with it. He moved forward as if the timeline were already written, focusing not on prolonging his own life, but on leaving something intact behind him. Ronnie Van Zant did not predict a plane crash. He did not describe an accident. He predicted an age, or rather, the absence of ages beyond it. When the crash came, it did not contradict his belief. It completed it. And in doing so, it reinforced the disturbing pattern seen throughout this list. Individuals who speak of their own ending not as speculation, but as recognition of a boundary already in place. Tupac Shakur, the lyrics and warnings that read like prophecy. Tupac Shakur spoke about death so often that it became inseparable from his public identity. For many listeners, this constant presence dulled its impact, reframing it as artistic persona rather than foresight. Yet when examined chronologically stripped of mythology and posthumous reverence, Tupac's words reveal a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as mere performance. He did not speak about death abstractly. He spoke about timing, consequence, and inevitability, often with the tone of someone who believed the ending had already been scheduled. In interviews, Tupac repeatedly stated that he did not expect to live past his mid-20s. He attributed this belief not to fear, but to environment the convergence of fame, violence, and unresolved conflict. What unsettled those around him was not the sentiment itself, but the certainty with which it was delivered. He spoke as if longevity were no longer among the available outcomes. "I don't see myself growing old," he said more than once, framing this statement not as pessimism, but as awareness. This sense of a closing horizon saturated his music. In songs recorded months before his death, Tupac wrote explicitly about being murdered, about being shot, about dying young and being remembered rather than saved. These were not vague allusions. They were detailed narratives that mirrored his real-life circumstances with increasing accuracy. He described paranoia, betrayal, and sudden violence not as hypothetical dangers, but as approaching certainties. Friends and collaborators later recalled that Tupac often spoke about death as something he was prepared for. He expressed concern not for himself, but for his legacy and for his mother. He took steps to secure financial arrangements and artistic control, actions that suggest a man organizing rather than hoping. This behavior intensified after the September 1996 shooting in Las Vegas, after which Tupac's earlier statements transformed from grim speculation into chilling prelude. On September 13, 1996, Tupac Shakur died from complications related to gunshot wounds sustained 6 days earlier. He was 25 years old, the age range he had repeatedly cited. The manner of death aligned with the scenarios he had described both in interviews and in lyrics. The convergence was so precise that it retroactively reframed his entire body of work, turning expression into evidence. Skeptics argue that Tupac's environment made such an outcome statistically likely. He lived amid conflict, embraced confrontation, and navigated spaces where violence was common. But this explanation ignores the psychological posture he maintained toward his own mortality. Tupac did not express hope of escape. He expressed readiness. His language suggests a man who believed he had already crossed a threshold where future paths narrowed to one. What remains most disturbing is how often Tupac framed death not as interruption, but as fulfillment, the closing act of a story already written. Whether this reflects intuition, self-fulfilling prophecy, or a deeper awareness of irreversible trajectory is unresolved, what is clear is that Tupac spoke about his death not as a fear to be avoided, but as a certainty to be faced. And when it arrived, it did so along the lines he had already drawn. Martin Luther King Jr., the final speech that sounded like farewell. Martin Luther King Jr. did not predict his death through dreams, dates, or visions. He did something more public and more unsettling. He spoke about it openly, on a stage, to a crowd, in language that carried the unmistakable tone of closure. What would later be called foresight was delivered instead as testimony calm, resolved, and unambiguous in its implication. On April 3, 1968, the night before his assassination, King delivered a speech at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. It was not intended to be historic. He was tired, ill, and initially reluctant to attend. When he arrived, he spoke without notes, addressing the ongoing struggle for civil rights. Then, near the end, his language shifted. He spoke about longevity, about having lived a full life, and about seeing the future from a distance he suggested he might not cross. "I may not get there with you," he said, referring to the promised land of equality and justice. The phrase landed heavily. King was not speculating about political setbacks. He was speaking about his own absence. He acknowledged the constant threats against his life, but dismissed them with composure. "I'm not worried about anything," he told the audience. "I'm not fearing any man." The statement was not defiant. It was final. Those close to King later remarked on his demeanor that night. He appeared unusually serene, even relieved. The speech did not sound like a rallying cry. It sounded like a farewell. When recordings were replayed after his death, listeners noted the absence of urgency. King did not ask the crowd to protect him. He did not speak of caution. He spoke as someone who believed his role was complete. The next day, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The nation reeled almost immediately. The final speech was replayed across the country. What had been interpreted as metaphor hours earlier now read as announcement. The alignment between his words and the event was so direct that it left little room for reinterpretation. Skeptics argue that King was simply acknowledging the danger inherent in his work. He had survived attacks before. He understood the risks. But this explanation fails to capture the tone of acceptance that permeated the speech. King did not speak as a man preparing for battle. He spoke as a man preparing for departure. There was no contingency in his language. No if, only may not. What distinguishes King's case from others is its scale. His premonition, if it can be called that, was not private or obscure. It was witnessed by thousands and preserved on tape. There is no reliance on memory or secondhand testimony. The words exist exactly as spoken, and they carry a weight that hindsight cannot fully explain away. Martin Luther King Jr. did not claim to see the future. He did not say he knew he would die. He did something more subtle and more disturbing. He spoke as if he no longer needed to be there. And the following day, history confirmed that he was right.